Sorry. Oh, dekat. Betul. What's your thesis? Any improvement? Ada?
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for APM Fellow Lecture Series organized by Academy of Professors Malaysia. I am Zaharul, a teaching fellow at University Putra Malaysia, your MC for this afternoon. Before we begin, please allow me to draw your attention to a few housekeeping matters. Please make sure that you are all in silent or muted mode. And to ask questions to the speakers, please use the chat box, stating your name and affiliation together with your questions. Yeah? And for those who are interested to get an e-certificate, please fill in the Google form that will be shared later in the chat box. Yeah? And thank you for your cooperation. Now, allow me to introduce our moderator for the session. Professor Datuk Dr. Rahmat Mohamad is the co-chair of Governance, Leadership and International Relations Cluster, Academy of Professors Malaysia. He is also an adjunct professor at the Faculty of Sharia and Law, University Islam Sultan Sharif Ali, Brunei Darussalam. I will now invite Datuk Rahmat to begin the session. Datuk Rahmat, please.
Thank you, Zarul. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good afternoon to our panel discussions, of course, distinguished and very eminent Professor James Chin and participants. On behalf of the APM, Academy Professor Malaysia, welcome all of you to another round of APM guest lecture series. And I think most of you are aware that the idea of having this APM guest lecture series is to promote and encourage members of the academia in a public space like this. Of course, one of it now is a webinar to air their concern in areas of common interest affecting our life as Malaysian generally, and looking at the economic, political, social perspective. And of course, in this way, we will have more deliberations, debates, and discussion on matters of importance to Malaysia. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are very honored and privileged to have with us a leading academic and a scholar to speak on the subject of significance to all Malaysian, entitled MA 63 or Malaysian Agreement 63, Historical Grievances and Nation Building. Before that, perhaps I will just make a short a summary of what is going on at the moment. I think it started with historically, where we know that Malaysia Agreement 1963 or MA 63 is a legal instrument that spell out the terms for the formation of Federation of Malaysia signed in London between the Great Britain, Federation of Malaya, then Singapore, North Borneo, now Sabah and Sarawak. And of course, the sensitive issue is where the 20 points agreement for Sabah and 80 points agreement in Sarawak, which were drafted and presented to the Intergovernmental Committee, IGC, which was tasked to work out the future constitutional arrangement, including safeguards for the special interests of Sabah and Sarawak to cover such matters, for example, religious freedom, education, representation in the federal parliament, special position of the indigenous races, control of immigration, and many more. Until today, unfortunately, have not been honored by the federal government. And the other thing that I would like to say here is that Sabah and Sarawak represent, as Professor James Chin said in one of his very leading article, says that it represents a unique political challenge to the Malaysian political landscape. First, from the inception of Sabah and Sarawak to form Malaysia in 1963, they are separated physically from Peninsula, different demography, culture, language, and history. And secondly, the unique stature of both states, Sabah and Sarawak, cannot be made similar, and you cannot use the model of what has been practiced in Peninsular Malaya to Sabah and Sarawak. I think these are very important issues that the Semenanjung or the Malaysian living in Sabah must understand. Sabah and Sarawak, although we are one Malaysia, but still, you know, these are things that must be understood thoroughly by all Malaysian. Now, before I invite Professor James Chin to deliver his lecture, let me introduce him to our participants. Professor James Chin is a professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, Australia. He was also the inaugural director of the Asian Institute Tasmania. He was a senior fellow and director of governance studies at the Jeffrey Chia Institute on Southeast Asia at Sunway University. Previously, a senior visiting researcher, fellows at the ISIS Singapore, professor of political science in Monash University Malaysia campus, and prior to his academic career, he worked as a journalist in Malaysia and Singapore. And he is a prolific writer. He has been writing numerous books and established journal all over the world. And I think the leading textbook would be in relation to Malaysian politics, where he co-edited the bestseller, Awakening Abdullah Badawi Years in Malaysia, Malaysia post Mahathir. And he is also known and highly regarded as the leading scholar of contemporary Sabah and Sarawak. And he has written also numerous articles on the political situation Sabah and Sarawak, and of course MA 63. So it is most appropriate that APM invite Professor James Chin to deliver his lecture on the subject of Malaysia Agreement 1963, historical grievances, and nation building. With that, Professor James Chin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dato'. I'd like to start off by thanking Academy Professors Malaysia for the very kind invitation to talk to all of you this afternoon on the issue of Sabah, Sarawak, and the Malaysia Agreement. As Dato' has mentioned, this is a crucial issue in the coming years, not only for the federal government, but in fact, it is a crucial issue for the entire federation as we move forward. What I'll do now is that I'll start the slides. Somebody has to disable my control, otherwise I cannot share the slide.
Yes, Prof. Proceed. Please proceed.
Okay, can you all see the slides now? Okay.
Yes, Prof.
Thank you. So basically this afternoon, what I'm going to do is to basically go through with all of you all the major issues related to MA 63 in terms of looking at nation building, and perhaps suggest ways that we can move forward on this issue. Basically, the 5 core areas that I'll be speaking about is the historical grievances, the 5 key areas of historical grievances. Then I'll talk about how the federal government has tried to deal with this issue in the last 10 years. Then I move forward to what is happening in Sabah and Sarawak. What are the people in Sabah and Sarawak are thinking in terms of MA 63? What are some of the options they're looking at? what are some of the popular solutions put forward by the people in Sabah and Sarawak. And finally, I'll talk something about nation building and how we can move this issue forward. So I think it's very important to start off on MA63 by looking basically at some of the reasons or some of the core questions that we have to ask ourselves. The interesting part about this, of course, is that these core issues and questions has been asked for many, many years. In fact, people started questioning MA63 back in the 1970s. And the reason why it was never an issue until the last 10 years was because of two reasons. One is, of course, in the old days, we don't have social media. So it's much more difficult for the voices in Sabah and Sarawak to reach the mainstream media. But secondly, a much more important thing happened in 2008. In 2008, basically, UMNO, although it won government, it had to rely on the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak to stay in power. So certainly the MPs in Sabah and Sarawak, or the state government in Sabah and Sarawak, became very powerful within the federal government equation. So because of that, you got groups agitating in Sabah and Sarawak, realized that they can really push MA63 to become a core political issue in Malaysia. So what are the sort of things that we're talking about when we talk about MA63? If you were to talk to the people in the street, some of the key questions they'll be asking, especially in Sabah and Sarawak, is that, is Sabah and Sarawak one of the 13 states in Malaysia, or is Sabah and Sarawak one of the 3 regions that came together to establish the Federation of Malaysia? For this year, you have the same issue. People will be asking, are you celebrating 59 years of the Federation or 65 years? Where do you count the independence of Malaysia? Do you count from 1957 or do you count from 1963? Every year, these sort of questions have been being asked. And of course, the other issue is that, what is the narrative on the formation of Federation of Malaysia? All this issue, of course, is highly, highly controversial. And this is linked primarily to the understanding of not only the formation of Malaysia, but the understanding of the Malaysian public towards the history of Sabah and Sarawak. So from there, I want to move on quickly and discuss the 5 key grievances. As we speak, what the organizers will put the key readings on this topic on the chat box. You can download it and read it in detail. So I'll jump through this very quickly. The first one, of course, is that the central argument is that there was no real consent given by the people of North Borneo then and Sarawak when it comes to the formation of Malaysia. All this was basically fixed by the British authorities and together with Lee Kuan Yew and Tunku Abdul Rahman. Secondly, people are very unhappy, as Dato' has mentioned. They feel that the 20 points has not been honored since 1963. The third one is the status of the Federation. People in Sabah and Sarawak are very unhappy that they're not accorded the status as one of the 3 founding partners in the Malaysian Federation. They feel quite strongly that they should not be looked upon politically as one of the 13 states in the Malaysian Federation. The other 2 is interrelated. One is that the people of Sabah and Sarawak are quite unhappy on what they perceive as federal intervention in state politics. And I'll go through in detail what I meant by that. And finally, item number 5 is that they're also quite unhappy with the way the politics has developed in Malaya and how the Malay political establishment in Peninsular Malaysia is trying to export this political model to Sabah and Sarawak. So if you look at all the differences, grievances that came through in the last 10 years, you can sort of group them into all these 5 areas. But I'll be only covering the key ones here, 3 ones here. The first one is, of course, the formation. I think a lot of people in Sabah and Sarawak, increasingly, if they look back at history, they've come to the conclusion that maybe that the people of Sabah and Sarawak were not properly consulted when it comes to the formation of Malaysia. If you look at the official process, it looks quite straightforward, and it looks like that there was extensive consultation done. We all know it all started with Tunku's important speech at the Singapore Press Club. From there, they created a thing called MSCC, where they discussed the initial idea of the federation. And from there, they formed a commission, the Kobok Commission, where they went to visit Sabah and Sarawak to ascertain the wishes of the people over there. And what they found basically was that 1/3 of the people that met were in agreement that the federation should be formed. 1/3 said that the federation should not be formed. And 1/3 said that we will be happy to go along with the federation as long as there are safeguards put in place. From then, it moved on to the IGC process. The IGC process is the process where they took the key results of the Kobok Commission and put it into the existing Malayan constitution, put in the safeguards, and that constitution was upgraded in 1963 into the Federation of Malaysia Constitution. From there, you had the Malaysia Agreement signed, and from there, because of opposition from the Philippines and Indonesia, a UN mission was dispatched to Sabah and Sarawak to double-check the findings of the Kobok Commission. One of the most remarkable things was that the results of the UN Commission showed that it was exactly the same. They found exactly the same thing. 1/3 of the people of North Borneo and Sarawak accept the Malaysian Federation. 1/3 said no, and 1/3 said that we'll be happy to go along as long as the safeguards will be put in place. And from them, of course, on the 16th of September, 1963, you had the proclamation of the Federation of Malaysia in Kuching and Kota Kinabalu. So that is the official process. So it looks like there were at least 3 rounds of consultation that took place. The MSCC, from then on you had the Kobok Commission, then you had the IGC. So it looks like there was extensive consultation done with at least the leaders of North Borneo and Sarawak before the formation of the Federation. Now, if you look at it closely, you'll find that, of course, it is not so easy. It's not so straightforward. Some of the important things have been left out of the official history. So, for example, what is not widely known is that after Tunku made the proposal in Singapore, there was a very high-level meeting of all the top British officials in Malaya, Singapore, the governor of Sabah, the governor of North Borneo, and the governor of Sarawak. They all met in Singapore, and the orders were given out that the British must ensure that the civil service in all these 4 areas use their full influence to make sure that this proposal is supported. Now, immediately after the Kobok Commission, there was a meeting in London where Macmillan, then Prime Minister of the UK, and Tunku actually met in London to decide on the date of independence. Even before the process will wrap up, they already decided that we were going to have independence, a new federation of North Borneo, Sabah, Sarawak, Singapore, and Malaya. The other thing that is increasingly interesting that has come out in the recent years is that there was a PhD done on this topic. The author was actually looking at confrontasi, but interestingly, one of the documents he dug out of the archives was that he found a very interesting document written to the British Foreign Office. And in that document, it was sent by the British delegation to the UN. It says that we're going to fix the results of the UN mission. In other words, the UN mission to Sabah and Sarawak, they already had the results in hand even before they went on a trip, because the British used their influence to make sure that they get favorable results. And that's the reason why earlier I mentioned that, what was remarkable about the UN results was that it was very similar to the Kobok Commission. Now, in terms of the 20 points, you can see that the key parts of 20 points is basically the Islam status as a national religion was not supposed to be applicable to Sabah and Sarawak. Immigration control was to be under the state government. There was supposed to be modernization of the civil service. This meant that as British officers left, all the key positions will be promoted among the local civil service. There was not supposed to be any changes to the safeguard without the agreement of the Sabah and Sarawak state governments. Other things are that the indigenous people of Sabah and Sarawak shall enjoy the same special rights given to the special position of the Malay community in Malaya. And of course, the bottom line is that Sabah and Sarawak were supposed to be regarded as equal partners in the federation. In other words, 1 out of 3. And because of that, they were supposed to be given a high level of autonomy. Now, if you were to speak to most people in Sabah and Sarawak, they'll argue that the spirit of the 20 points was not kept. The only thing that was kept was immigration control. So until today, immigration is still under the control of the state governments in Kota Kinabalu and Kuching, but it is no longer a requirement for many, many years for people from Peninsular Malaysia to use their passport to enter Sabah and Sarawak. Now all you need to do is to basically show your IC. In terms of Sabah, in practical terms, they have removed all conditions. You can actually get into Sabah much easier compared to getting into Sarawak. My understanding is that for a Peninsular Malaysian person, you still show your IC, but you actually don't have to sign a piece of paper if you want to enter Sabah. Now, in terms of point number one, Islam status, what happened is Sabah is that in the early 1970s, the Sabah constitution was changed by Tun Mustafa to make Islam the official religion of Sabah. Sarawak is the only state in Malaysia where they've kept to the 20 points, and that Islam is still not the official state religion for Sarawak. Okay, now I want to move on very quickly to federal intervention in state politics and why the people in Sabah and Sarawak are very angry about this. Now remember, I said one of the spirits of the 20 points is that the people of Sabah and Sarawak expect to have a very high level of autonomy. Now, of course, when you talk about high level autonomy, you're basically talking about political autonomy. But this has not happened. In Sarawak's case, even if you look on it from the surface, right, it was very clear that the federal government has intervened successfully at least 3 times. Of course, there are more, but these are the 3 big ones. In 1966, they removed the IBAN chief ministers. In 1970, they ensured that Malayan Muslim was appointed the chief minister. And in 1987, they supported the current Sarawak governor, Taib Mahmud, in its fight with his uncle, Tun Rahman Yaakob. So this is examples of a very, very clear example how the federal government has intervened to get an outcome they wanted at the state level. In Sabah, it's even worse. In Sabah, the federal government has intervened many times. In fact, the intervention started, immediately after the formation of the federation. UMNO sent a Malay businessman called Syed Kecik to Sabah to help him rule the state under Tun Mustafa Harun. Those of you who are old enough to remember in the 1960s, the early 70s, you will remember that Mustafa Harun was a highly controversial chief minister of Sabah. One of the things about his rule was that he was almost never around. In one particular year, if I'm not mistaken, he was out of the state for 9 months out of the whole year. And when he was out of the state, instead of passing the control of the state to another Sabahan, the state was basically ruled by Syed Kecik. And in fact, Syed Kecik has actually confirmed this to a journalist who wrote his unofficial biography, that he was the one who was sent by UMNO to make sure that Sabah was under control. In 1975, the federal government again intervened by helping to set up a party called Berjaya, interested enough to get rid of Mustafa Harun. The reason why they didn't trust Mustafa Harun was because Mustafa Harun put out a paper at the internal party meeting which says that Sabah should look into the possibility of independence. So because of that, the federal government decided to support a new party called Berjaya. And this has been confirmed by one of the leading leaders of Berjaya, Haris Saleh, another ex-Sabah chief minister, who came out in a video recently to confirm that yes, UMNO supported the formation of Berjaya. And of course, 10 years later, 1986 and 1990, throughout the 4 years, the federal government put a lot of pressure on Parti Bersatu Sabah to ensure that the Muslims are always on the top table. And of course, the federal government played a very important role in the downfall of PBS in 1994. But the biggest issue for Sabahans on top of this political intervention is, of course, Sabahans are very angry about the demography of the state of Sabah. Many Sabahans will blame the federal government for allowing the states to become a Muslim majority state. So if you look at the statistics, right, it is clear from 1970 to 2010, there was a natural increase of 390% in Sabah's population. In other words, this is the infamous Project M, or sometimes people call Project IC, where the demography of Sabah changed from a non-Muslim majority state to become a Muslim majority state. And if you look at the statistic, it's very clear. In 1976, the Kadazan Dusun Murut seats were the majority in the state assembly. By 1996, it became a Muslim majority state. So the only outcome in any elections in Sabah nowadays is either you get a Muslim government or a Muslim plus government. In other words, the original Kadazan Dusun Murut people of Sabah are no longer in a position to capture government. And many people blame this, of course, on federal intervention. Now, in terms of the export of the Malayan political model to Sabah and Sarawak, I don't have to remind the audience that the driving force in Peninsular Malaysian politics is race and religion. You also know that this is not as sharp in Sabah and Sarawak. Most political parties in Sabah and Sarawak are multiracial in terms of membership. And very often, many of these parties, they don't have a single ethnic group that dominates. So a lot of people say that the West Malaysian model of Islam, political Islam, racial politics, this thing will not work very well in Sabah and Sarawak. In fact, it will lead to more divisions among the relatively good relations between the ethnic groups in Sabah and Sarawak. And of course, when people talk about the export of the Malayan political model, they're also talking about the export of the Ketuanan Melayu model. But the problem is that this model doesn't sit very well with Sabah and Sarawak because the Malays are minority in both Sabah and Sarawak. When you export the Ketuanan Melayu model to Sabah and Sarawak, basically you're marginalizing the biggest indigenous grouping over there. In the case of Sarawak, it's of course the Ibans, and in the case of Sabah, it's the Kadazan Dusun. Now, I want to quickly move on to the next part of my talk, which is the federal government's approach to Sabah and Sarawak since 2008. Prior to that, right, as I mentioned, Sabah and Sarawak were really not regarded as a political issue at all. In fact, prior to 2008, if you speak to the people in Kuala Lumpur, they will remind you that Sabah and Sarawak are regarded as fixed deposit. In other words, we don't have to worry about Sabah and Sarawak. They will always vote Barisan no matter what. It was after 2008 elections that suddenly Najib woke up to the fact that we cannot control the federal government without the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak. We have lost power. We have lost our two-thirds majority. So that's the reason why during Najib's administration in 2009, he made Malaysia Day a public holiday, September 16. Prior to that, most people have never even heard of September 16. It was also a time where there was a record appointments of more than 20 politicians from Sabah and Sarawak who were appointed into the cabinet as ministers or deputy ministers, the largest cohort since 1963. On top of that, the speaker and the two deputy speakers in parliament were given to candidates from Sabah and Sarawak. And of course, he made the very famous announcement in Kota Kinabalu, where he mentioned that there will be a $1 billion additional allocation to Sabah and Sarawak. And he also set up a federal cabinet supposedly to deal with the MA63 committee issues, all the historical grievances. And of course, we know that he lost power in 2018, and there was no report issued from that committee. Now, if we look at the era of Pakatan Harapan, what was really interesting was that Pakatan Harapan really understood the grievances of the people of Sabah and Sarawak. So that's the reason why for the very first time, the major manifesto among all the major political parties in Malaysia, for the very first time, the issue of Malaysia Agreement or Sabah and Sarawak became one of the core issues in the manifesto. So if you can dig up the old manifesto put up by Pakatan Harapan in 2018, you find that there were this thing called the 5 pillars, and one of the 5 pillars was the issue of Malaysia Agreement. Immediately after achieving power, of course, Mahathir set up MA63 committee, a new one, and this was put under the purview of VK Liew, the late Dato' VK Liew from Sabah, who was also the law ministers. At the end of that process, which took about 1.5 years, the committee claimed that they were able to resolve 17 out of 21 issues. But some of these issues actually were not related to MA63. things like the oil and gas issue, Territory Sea Act, all those things are actually not mentioned in MS63, but still, because of the grievances, they decided to add it on. So basically, a lot of it dealt with administrative issues. 17 out of 21 was resolved, but the 4 big issues dealing with oil and gas, who owns the oil and gas, who owns the territory seas, all those things were not resolved. One of the really interesting aspects of this work of this committee was that even though Dr. V. Khalil was quite happy for the report to be tabled, he was quite happy for the report to be released to the public. When the government fell in 2020, the new Perikatan national government decided to put the report under the OSA, which is unfortunate because that created a lot of negative perception and created more suspicion among the people of Sabah and Sarawak that the federal government has something to hide. The other important thing related to MS63 in the 2 years when Pakatan was in power was, of course, that they fell in terms of their constitution amendment. They tried to amend the first part of the constitution, Article 1.2, to make sure that Sabah and Sarawak went back to the original wording of 1963. They were not able to, primarily because the Sarawakians refused to support the amendment put forward by Pakatan Harapan. The other interesting part, of course, that was not revealed to the public was that even though there was such a committee working, trying to resolve the issue, at the end of the day, the Prime Minister Mahathir was not in favor of more rights to Sabah and Sarawak. Mahathir, as all of you know, was a strong believer in a strong state, and this meant a very strong federal government. So at the end of the day, although he went along with the process in terms of the MS63 committee, deep down inside, he did not really believe that that we should grant any more rights, especially constitutional rights, to Sabah and Sarawak. He wanted a strong state because he believed that to move Malaysia forward, we needed a very strong federal government. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the big problem with the working of the committee was that Sarawak was not part of Pakatan Harapan, and Parti Warisan was just a partner of Pakatan Harapan. They were not a full member of Pakatan Harapan. Now, when the government fell in 2020, Muhyiddin got into power, and this is where it becomes interesting. Sabah and Sarawak actually became even more influential, especially GPS from Sarawak, because Muhyiddin depended on GPS to stay in power. So that's the reason why suddenly GPS had 4 full ministers, including a senior minister. As you all remember, right, Muhyiddin got rid of the deputy prime minister's post and decided to create the position of senior ministers. So 1 out of the 4 was immediately given to a Sarawak ministers. Sarawak also demanded and got from Muhyiddin in terms of the sale tax from Petronas. Petronas was forced to cough up with an initial payment of 2 billion. And from then onwards, Petronas will have to pay all the sale tax to Sabah and Sarawak. And that's actually worth quite a lot of money. So that's the reason why the Sarawak government is flush with money. Muhyiddin also followed through on MS63. A new committee was set up, but he also set up a minister for Sabah and Sarawak affairs in the PM's department. The minister is Max Onkili from Sabah, and the deputy is from Sarawak. The focus of this new committee was actually on decentralization and getting the constitution amendment, because they also wanted to proceed with the constitution amendment. It was also during this time that Muhyiddin announced that Sabah and Sarawak will no longer be called Negeri. They'll be given a new change called Wilayah. You have to remember back in 2020, the focus was actually on trying to win Sabah, because Sabah had a state election in September, and the upcoming Sarawak state election, which was held in December last year. So the focus was basically on the 2 state elections. So things were not really moving very well. Everything was sort of put in hold. Another reason why everything was put in hold, not only for the MS63 issue, for the entire government, was, of course, there was lots of infighting in the Perikatan government. And of course, Muhyiddin himself was trying to survive all the political issues. And of course, we know that he did not survive. He only survived until August last year when he was deposed by UMNO. So under this new UMNO-led Ismail Sabri government, same setup, they carry on with the MS63 committee. Now they're calling it a special committee. They just do a name change. Again, it comes under the same minister, Onkili, the same deputy. It was during this time that Sarawak did approach the federal government, asked whether they wanted to consider appointing somebody from Sabah and Sarawak to be the DPM. Of course, they were knocked back. They said that we're not willing to go through with it. We will just carry through. We still with the senior minister system. So there was basically no change. The only big change, of course, was that they did pass the Constitution Amendment on the 14th of December last year. But again, that was symbolic. The most important element people forget is that it's not so much that they changed the wording back to the original thing, was that the Constitution for the very first time referred to the Malaysian Agreement specifically, MA63, and also the powers to define who is a Bumiputera was given back to the state of Sarawak. So now for the entire Malaysia, for the definition of Bumiputera, in terms of Sarawak, they have to refer to the Sarawak Constitution. Now, I don't expect anything to happen moving forward on MA63 core issues. The reason is because the entire Malaysian government is now on hold because everyone is preparing for the upcoming GE15. Although GE15 is not due until next year, it is my contention that the government is on hold, is on election mode because everyone is planning to hold a GE15 this year. Now, this is where it becomes even more interesting. If UMNO wins 2/3 majority or get very close to 2/3 majority, I can guarantee you the MA63 issue will be sidelined again. In other words, when the Malay political establishment in Peninsular Malaysia do not require the support of the MPs of Sabah and Sarawak, this thing immediately will be sidelined again. Based on my own work and my interviews with the political class, it is my contention that there is no more political appetite among the Malay establishment on MA63. In other words, they think that the last amendment made in December 2021 is enough to satisfy Sabah and Sarawak, and they're unwilling to see any more constitutional amendments that deal specifically with MA63. So the best case scenario for Sabah and Sarawak is that UMNO do not get a clear majority. They will win around 100, 110 seats, and where GPS will come in and they will require the support from Sabah and Sarawak again. And if they do that again, then we'll be back to the same situation as we have now, where they will have to take MA63 issues seriously. So moving on quickly, what are some of the popular solutions you find about in Sarawak and Sabah? I think if you were to talk to people in the street, people keep talking about complete autonomy. They're saying that this is the best time because of a weak federal government. We've got to take back our rights and we want to go for complete autonomy, although no details are given. What you find is that almost all the mobilization done on MA63 issues in Sabah and Sarawak is done through the social media. Interestingly enough, what is not widely known in Malaysia is that some of these groups advocating for Sabah and Sarawak are actually based outside Sabah and Sarawak. The most active groups are the one based in the UK. Another group that's quite active is based in Australia. And these are mostly led by Sabahans, interestingly enough. And a lot of Sabahan students and Sarawakian students are actively involved with these groups. The other thing that you find in terms of popular solutions is that all the major political players in Sabah and Sarawak, it doesn't matter whether they're in the opposition or in the government, nobody will admit to being anti-MA. In other words, everybody says that they are the champions of MA63. They want to bring back complete autonomy. They want to take back our rights. But if you try to get them to drill down to the details, they can't provide you with any details at all because they themselves do not know. So basically, the bottom line is that there's basically three basic approaches to try to resolve this issue from Sabah and Sarawak. The first one is that you have to work with the current system to get autonomy. In other words, you support the current federal government-led process. This is what is called a friendly approach. You try to discuss everything and try to get back as much autonomy as possible. The two big areas that they're currently in discussion is of course health and education. Both state government are quite keen to take back control of health services and education. It's an issue of who pays for it. The money part is always the thing that sort of made the negotiations very difficult. Working with autonomy also means that you want to keep Malayan parties out of Sabah and Sarawak as much as possible. The second approach is, of course, what they talked about, working towards a new Malaysia. Again, this term is not new. Since 2018, we're supposed to be building a new Malaysia. The idea is that forget about what happened, all the difficult experiences in the past. We want to work towards a new set of federal-state relations. In other words, the current system doesn't work anymore. We want to work on a new system. We want to relook at the whole issue from a new perspective. So that's the reason why, for example, in Sarawak, since the Constitution Amendment, the Sarawak Chief Minister is no longer called the Ketua Menteri, he's called the Premier of Sarawak. The idea is to constantly remind the political class that you cannot treat Sabah and Sarawak like what you did prior. We are now more or less equal partners in the federation. Again, this also means keeping the Malayan political establishment out as much as possible. And if you need be, under New Malaysia, you will sue to get your rights back. So that's the reason why there's currently 2 lawsuits filed in Kota Kinabalu, try to get back the 40% grants guaranteed to Sabah under the Constitution. The third one, of course, is that people say that we have to give up. The federation doesn't work anymore. We basically are working to lay the groundwork for eventual succession for the Federation of Malaysia. Of course, this work is highly sensitive in the Malaysian context. So if you talk to these people in Sabah and Sarawak, very often they will not use the word succession, but they will replace the word succession with things like referendum, unilateral declaration of independence, and they'll say things like, all people have the right to self-determination because it is written into the Charter of the United Nations. Again, a lot of these are targeted through social media, and they're trying to build a big support among the younger Sabahans and Sarawakians. Now, I just want to quickly go through with you the secessionist arguments. I think this is something that is not widely known in the public. They hear about it, but they don't know what is the nature of the argument they're making. So I just want to quickly go through with you what are the sort of major reasonings behind the secessionist movement. The first one, of course, is that they argue that the MA63 treaty is an international treaty, but because it has been broken so many times, it is fundamentally invalid. And the other reason why it's fundamentally invalid is what I said earlier, is because the people of North Borneo and Sarawak did not give a proper consent to the formation of the federation. Second reason they say it's fundamentally invalid is that the people of North Borneo and Sarawak cannot talk about a federation because they are not independent. At the time when this was discussed, there was, in effect, in practice, colonies or under the control of the British, and therefore they just went along with whatever the British wanted. So therefore, how can you say that you can even get a proper voice or even a proper voice when it comes to the issue of the federation? You can't. Therefore, the British manipulated the entire process. So because of that, the MA63 treaty is fundamentally invalid. Secondly, they argue that this treaty cannot be fixed because for the last 50 years, not only too many promises are broken, you have totally marginalized Sabah and Sarawak. The favorite saying is that they have stolen the entire oil and gas resources from Sabah and Sarawak, and these resources are used to build up Peninsular Malaysia. So they talk about, you look at KLIA, you look at North-South Highway, you look at the Petronas Tower, they say at the end of the day, all this money actually came from the oil and gas resources from Sabah and Sarawak. The third argument is that the Malayan political framework, essentially based on race and religion, will never work in Sabah and Sarawak. And as I explained already, part of it is because the Malays are minority in Sabah and Sarawak. The other reason in recent years, they talk about a thing called the Chagos issue. Chagos is a small island in the Indian Ocean. A couple of years ago, there was an ICJ advisory opinion, not a judgment, ICJ opinion that says that if you're a colony of another power, you don't have the right to talk about things like independence. So, so among the secessionist movement, they got very excited. They said, see, there's an international jury system that agrees with us that Sabah and Sarawak really were not in a position when the federation idea was mooted back in the 1960s, they were not in a position to give a proper answer. The other example they gave, of course, is that there's no such thing as that you can't get out. If you can join a federation, this means you can also get out of the federation. And they like to give the example of Singapore. They said that, how can you say that there was no right to secede from the federation? If there's no right to secede from the federation, how did Singapore get out, in 1965? If you say there's no right to get out, then Singapore should not have been allowed to become an independent nation in 1965. So finally, I want to talk a bit about the way forward. In terms of nation building, how should we move forward on this issue? I think basically we need to find a new narrative for the formation of Malaysia. This narrative that's been used for the last 50 years, the narrative of Ketuanan Melayu, the narrative that Malaysia is a Malay state, I think is not going to work for the people of Sabah and Sarawak. And if you carry on this way, I think there's going to be political consequences. I think basically in terms of the remedies, I think there are two ways of looking at it. One is the legal remedies. The other, of course, is the political remedies. But the problem is that in the Malaysian context, I'll argue that you cannot separate the legal from the political, because everything in Malaysia is political in nature. You can't say that this is a legal issue, it's not a political issue. Something like MA63, right? There's no way you can separate the legal from the political. And therefore, you have to look at this as a very holistic approach, which takes into account both the legal, the political, and the social issues all lumped together. But basically, in order to move forward, certain difficult questions will have to be asked. And one of the difficult questions that the political establishment will have to ask themselves is that who is accountable for all the past misdeeds that was done in the name of MA63? So some of the issues that I want to canvass in terms of moving forward is that in terms of constitutional provisions, as I said earlier, the Malay political establishment in Peninsular Malaysia has no more appetite for any more amendments. But the problem is that the people of Sabah and Sarawak expect there will be more amendments which lock into the constitution safeguards for Sabah and Sarawak. In other words, they're looking for some sort of autonomy bill, or different parts of the Malaysian constitution will have to be amended to show that Sabah and Sarawak will have a high degree of autonomy. But this leads to a very interesting question. If you grant special autonomy to Sabah and Sarawak, what happens to other states who are also looking for autonomy? Example, again, out in the open, Kelantan and Johor has been asking for years for autonomy. And if you give them autonomy, does this mean that you allow these states to build a state within a state? Are you promoting more differences between all the different states in the federation? And if you say that you want to promote autonomy and move to a decentralized system, are you saying that every state will be given whatever autonomy is given to Sabah and Sarawak? Or are you saying that the additional safeguards is only for Sabah and Sarawak? And if you do that, what about the feelings of the other states? I can guarantee you, if you grant more and more autonomy to Sabah and Sarawak, the Johorians and the Kelantanis will be very, very unhappy, especially in terms of things like oil and gas. How do you divide it up? Because the idea of the PDA 1974, the Petronas, was that oil and gas resources, because you're the federation, you have to pool your resources together, everybody shares. But the feelings in Sabah and Sarawak is that because for the last 50 years, oil and gas resources has been used to build up Peninsular Malaysia. Now is the time for us to own our own resources because we need to build up Sabah and Sarawak. So ultimately, are you looking at a new model of federal-state relations? And if you are, how are you going to design a new model? So in the immediate future, I would argue that we need to change the narrative of the Federation of Malaysia. What is Malaysia? I think this is a very, very difficult question to answer because it depends on who you ask. Even within Peninsular Malaysia or Malaya itself, there is no common answer about what is Malaysia. Some people say it's a Malay state. Some people say it's a multiracial state. You got all sorts of answers, depending on who does the answering. So basically, I think we need a new narrative for the Federation. And this new narrative will have to take into account the history of Sabah and Sarawak and the diversity of Sabah and Sarawak. Secondly, I argue that you need more visits across the South China Sea, not simply touch and go. It is quite interesting that when I speak to politicians in Sabah and Sarawak and the politicians in West Malaysia or Peninsular Malaysia, most of them from Sabah and Sarawak have visited Peninsular Malaysia. A lot of them have actually lived there, because what happened is that their children are studying there, so they spend extended periods in Peninsular Malaysia or Malaya. But that is not true for the politicians in Peninsular Malaysia. Most of them come to Sabah and Sarawak on what we call official trips, touch and go. They come for a very short period. Unless you actually posted there, I think it's very difficult to understand the depth of the feeling of the people of Sabah and Sarawak. I think moving forward, whether you like it or not, as I mentioned, in terms of accountability, you have to admit that Sabah and Sarawak were left out for, especially during the Malaysian plans, for the first 4 plans, and that you really need to set up special funding for Sabah and Sarawak to catch up, especially in terms of infrastructure development. One of the interesting things is, of course, if you look at the official government figures, you see that Sabah is consistently one of Malaysia's poorest states, and yet it is an oil and gas producing state. At the top of the civil service, in terms of the administration, I think you also have to look at the issue of whether you want to impose a Sabah Sarawak quota at the very top to reflect, that Sabah Sarawak's position in the federation. But I have to caution here that if you want to create a quota, the quota must be very, very specific, and it must have an end date. You do not want to create a situation like the NEP where the quota is there forever, because that will lead to resentment in the future. And basically, the final point is, of course, something that I've mentioned over and over again in this lecture, and that is the political class in Malaya must accept the fact that Sabah and Sarawak are different, that race and religion play a less important political role in Sabah and Sarawak, and that trying to force the people of Sabah and Sarawak to accept the Malayan political model simply pushes the people further away from Putrajaya. And of course, we need a common narrative over the long term, not only for Sabah and Sarawak, but for the whole country of Malaysia. So in conclusion, I think the MA63 issues and the related issues will not go away for the foreseeable future. It is a compelling narrative about marginalization and self-determination. It is something that is uniquely suited for the 21st century and the age of social media. It is also a legacy of colonial rule. This is not unique. The issue of autonomy, marginalization, self-determination is not unique to this part of the world. You just have to look in Sabah, Southern Philippines, Southern Thailand, Aceh, Papua, Kalimantan, all of them are suffering from the same issue. My argument is that we have a very, a very good opportunity now to fix it, especially now that, Malaysia has gone through its first regime change, and that the federal government has an incentive to deal with this issue. And it is my argument that the federal government will have to act. They have to act very, very soon, because if they don't do anything now, a lot of negative consequences will follow. And that the people of Malaysia should really pay close attention to what's happening in Sabah and Sarawak. Because if they don't, the secessionist movement will become bigger and bigger, and they may pose, interesting issues when it comes to the future of the Federation of Malaysia. Thank you very much. So I just want to finish with a very short quotation. You study the past if you would like to define the future, and that's the reason why you need to understand MA63. Not only understand it in Sabah and Sarawak, but I think it's very, very important that the population in Peninsular Malaysia understand the issue thoroughly. Thank you. And I've got a list of readings that if you're interested, you might want to look through this at your own time. But as I mentioned, there should be 2 of these readings in the chat box now for you to download and read later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor James Chain, for the very informative lecture. And I'm sure there are questions from the participants, and I will not make any summarization of your lecture. I think we leave it there, and we will let the participants to perhaps give their comment. And now I would like to move on to our panel of discussion. And I would like to invite Dr. Sharifah Munira Al-Atas, being the first discussant. And before I invite Dr. Sharifah, allow me to introduce Dr. Sharifah. He is a lecturer at University Kebangsaan Malaysia, and previously was the managing editor of Journal of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations, as well as editor-in-chief of IDFR journals and occasional paper series. Her writings focuses on comprehensive security, foreign policy, freshwater scarcity, and conflict studies, mostly in relation to South Asia and Southeast Asia. And some of her previous appointments have been the Director of Academic Programs at the Nilai Inter-University College, Malaysia, the Director of Research and Publication of IDFR, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also a political analyst at ISIS Malaysia. With that, may I have the honor to invite Dr. Sharifah Munira Al-Atas to give her view as regard to the topic. You have the floor, Dr. Sharifah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, although that was a very old biography. Sorry, I did not probably update it. Nevertheless, I'd like to thank APM for inviting me and to acknowledge the expert presentation of James, which I'm not surprised. So I am no expert in Sabah and Sarawak or MA63, although I do sympathize with the sentiments, because I must say that many of us in Malaya are also fighting a similar battle with the administration over the many decades. But let me become very specific about how I see the bigger picture of this problem of MA63 and the position of Sabah and Sarawak in the Federation. My area, I write and I teach, I do research on international relations and geopolitics. And to me, uppermost in the relationship between countries is always about exploitation and power. And the way I see the relationship between Malaya and East Malaysia is a relationship of exploitation and power. It's a one-way relationship. Now, this is how I see the problem that is extremely complex. And as James also ended his presentation saying that it is unlikely to be solved in the very near future, and we don't know how long it's going to take. So I will focus my discussion predominantly on three aspects of what James has presented, and provide a different angle, a rather holistic, bigger picture angle, but complementary, I hope, to what James has just said. I will give my views on the federal-state relations. The second part of my discussion would be on the constitutional amendments that have taken place. I will include within this discussion an aspect of the Rukun Negara, which has been neglected all these decades, and associate that with nation building. And the third part of my discussion, I will probably talk about something that's very common, very much discussed, especially during the last 3 years, is the breakdown of good governance in the country. Now, about the federal-state relations. Now, this specifically refers to the slides that I got from James, and it refers to his fifth and sixth slides, I think, about the 20 points that were negotiated between the Borneo states and during Pakatan Harapan. The fact that it's still under OSA, it's because the issues are about regular supply of revenue. Maybe I'm getting it wrong, but again, it's this exploitation and this power game that is being played back and forth. It's about the regular supply of revenue that the federal government wants, the financial and resource security. It's another way of saying that Malaya persists in exploiting the resources and the people of Sabah and Sarawak. I mean, there's no mincing of the relationship. When we talk about the oil royalties, the petroleum cash payments, and state rights over the continental shelf, all of that. So it is screaming exploitation. Withholding the complete report of those negotiations demonstrates an aspect of what I mentioned earlier about how states communicate with each other on the geopolitical front, okay? It demonstrates a domineering, big power mentality. So this is the treatment that Sabah and Sarawak are feeling that they are getting from the federal government. I mean, we see this kind of behavior between China and Taiwan, for instance. I mean, I can draw a parallel, although it's not an accurate one, because Taiwan is an independent country. Nevertheless, it's this feeling of ownership. You know, a superpower owns a smaller power, and over a territory that's rich in strategic value. The Borneo states should not be treated as such. And I don't know if this, of course, as James correctly said, it's the age of social media where a lot of these discussions are already taking place. But I'm not so sure many Malayans at the Kopitiam here understand what the issues really are, what the details of the issues are. I'll get into that when I speak a little bit about how to change the narrative and the state of our education and why that's not helping. I'd like to say something about what James mentioned about the constitutional amendments, and then I'm going to relate this to what I think should be brought up about the Rukun Negara, the principles of the Rukun Negara and nation building, to relate that to nation building. Sabah and Sarawak are no longer considered states. Yeah, they are known as Wilayah. But as James said, it's just a change in name. But really, what do we call this entity, Sabah and Sarawak? What is the nomenclature? How is it going to be reflected in the constitution, in the federal constitution? How will it be referred to in the general public when we discuss over a dinner or a lunch? How do teachers talk about it with their students in schools? So the issue of nomenclature is a very important one. It's a very sensitive one. And it's it's a shared identity that must be discussed in detail, without which I don't see how there will be an understanding about what the basic grievances of the Borneo states are among the people of Malaya. Now, it's a matter of how to conscientize society about these basic changes. Wilayah is just a superficial name change. It doesn't mean anything. Now, how is that translated into nation building and inclusive of a national identity? Constitutional amendments are a very small part of nation building. Nation building actually requires painstaking struggles on the ground to nurture a feeling of inclusivity, to be an inclusive national identity. For example, it is inaccurate to say, I just read an article recently written by a columnist, actually quite very well written, but there was a slip in the sentences that he used. I wrote it down here. He wrote, there are set ways of perceiving Sabah and Sarawak as equal autonomous entities, but united. I've got it wrong. Let me go back to that later. I think he mentioned Sabah and Sarawak joining Malaysia together with Malaya. Now, when you use the word join as opposed to form, the general public gets confused or does not understand the actual density of the problem. We need to indoctrinate. I'm using a very negative term, but on the other hand, indoctrinate people's minds as to what the basic grievances are, as James has said. Now, when I mentioned earlier about bringing back the Rukunegara, this is related to how to change people's mindset. The Rukunegara has actually, we all know it's made up of 5 points. It's printed at the back of school exercise books. However, as guiding principles, those 5 points are very important. And I'm not saying that we should not follow that. What I'm referring to is the entire document of the Rukunegara, which is about 20,000 words. It consists of an introduction, the declaration, which is the 5 points, and a commentary. What has been largely neglected over the decades are both the introduction and the commentary. And many aspects of the commentary are very relevant to Sabah and Sarawak and the issue and the problem, the complex problem of MA 63. We need to include sections of this Rukunegara, okay? And I will mention 3 that might help in what James has suggested in changing the narrative. So what are these 3 points to include from the Rukunegara? The first is fundamental liberties and freedom are guaranteed by our Constitution, but these rights shall not be abused in the name of democracy to promote racialism or destroy democracy itself. Now, how is this relevant to the MA 63 problem? The issue of immigration, for instance, citizenship rights, that has a very important connection with promoting racialism, destroying democracy, as James referred to. The second point is this sentence in the commentary, which says, it is the duty of every citizen to respect the historical background of the Constitution. This has implications for the 20 points. And in James' conclusion, you did mention about we need to have a very strong sense of history and of colonial history as well. So it has implications for the 20 points and developments within the Sabah Constitution in 1973 point to that. I mean, the point is that Islam is now the official religion. I think that's what I understood, which is against the democratic rights of the people. The third point, no citizen should question the loyalty of another citizen on the grounds that he belongs to a particular community. Now, this is very important in order to change the narrative, because what I'm hearing also is those Sabahans and Sarawakians, they are noisy, they are disloyal. You know, if they don't like it, they can get out. So this is the attitude that Malayans have towards the East Malaysians. But if you look at this sentence, to want autonomy does not mean the people are disloyal to king, country, and constitution. You know, there's a lack of understanding about what autonomy means and what disloyalty and being seditious and all that means. So I think we have to be very careful and we have to be very conscious of principles that are already in place such as the Rukunegara. And let me make a footnote here. I think there might be many participants or anyone who's listening here to roll their eyes and say, Rukunegara is a dead document, who cares about it? The 5 points are enough and nothing has changed as a result. Well, my point here is to say that the problems have arisen because we have ignored a great chunk of the Rukunegara, and which is the commentary, a bit of which I have already mentioned. On the last part about this Rukunegara, there is a small part which was not included in it, but it is one sentence which exists in the handwritten notes of one of the members of the drafting committee. And this handwritten note, there were, I think, 15 points, and one of the points reads, this is what one of the points reads: to reject psychological feudalism, corruption, exploitation, and all forms of oppression. So again, I'm suggesting how to change the narrative, how to imbue in the young Malaysians, not just Malayans, but the people of Sabah and Sarawak as well, how to imbue in them the idea that we need to also reject it's not just perceived exploitation, it is real exploitation. Reject corruption and the feudalism that is imposed by Malaya on Sabah and Sarawak. This is how I see it. And I'm not an expert on this issue, okay? But I'm looking at it from a completely different angle. Now, I'd like to suggest a few points we can ponder upon and maybe discuss later. The issue of secession that James brought up, and relating to federal-state relations. I have a few questions here that maybe we can discuss later. Is Putrajaya's race and religious card strong enough to prevent secession? Do Sabah and Sarawak actually feel they can be now just for the sake of argument, can they be as successful as Singapore should they secede? Another question is secession more likely for Sabah rather than Sarawak due to the interests of Sarawak's Malanau ruling elites who are Muslim? So that's another question I'm hoping we can discuss. And this issue of New Malaysia, yeah, I mean, that's another slogan that's fallen flat on its face. But is New Malaysia, meaning a possible new model of federal-state relations? My question is, how is it possible with a very weak opposition that we have seen ever since GE14, and it's proceeding to weaken even more? How is it possible to have a new model of federal-state relations, given that we have a crumbling opposition, a very weak opposition? And how much is our generation, my generation, in Malaya, educating the young Malayans about all these questions and about this complex problem? And this is where the narrative of Sabah and Sarawak is maybe not loud enough over here in Malaya. But when you talk about education, this is a whole different can of worms, and it's also very complicated, I understand. But this new model of federal-state relations for Sabah and Sarawak nationalists, in order for them to be taken seriously, and even before any talk of secession, what is the inclusive discourse that they are delivering to Malayans? I know that it is, I understand it, but I'm referring to the general population among the Malayans. They fail to see what their discourse, how inclusive the discourse is. It must cut across Muslim-Christian divide. But so far, I think the Borneo nationalists have been mainly Christian, less visibly so Muslim. And the reality is you need to have a Muslim-based discourse among the nationalists as well. So that's my other question. And maybe my proposition, as how I started my discussion, is should part of this new narrative that James mentioned towards the end, the new narrative to the young in Malaya and across Malaysia, in fact, should we include geopolitical narratives, geopolitical language? Because young people today are very aware of how big powers are threatening our sovereignty in the South China Sea, for instance. We're very aware of what is happening in Palestine. We're very aware of what is happening in Myanmar. Young people are angry. You know, they're reading what is happening around them outside of Malaysia. The fact that we don't have good commentators about it officially is a different matter. But among the young, they are aware of geopolitics. So maybe we should, include in the narrative of exploitation that the Sabah and Sarawak do not wish to further be exploited. And I'm not offering solutions. I'm just offering maybe an attempt to change the direction of the narrative.
Is that, can
Yes.
I have Dr. Sharifah?
I'm actually done. I'd like to thank you.
Just summarize in 1 minute, please.
I'm done, actually.
Okay, you're done. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sharifah. There are loads of questions and issues raised by Dr. Sharifah. I'm sure Professor James Chin is in anticipation of those questions, and perhaps you would like to elaborate later in the third round. May I now invite Professor Abdul Halim Ali, the second discussant. And before I invite him, let me introduce Professor Abdul Halim Ali. Of course, he is a veteran sociologist, and he is one of the pioneering members of the Department of Anthropology and Sociology of University Kebangsaan Malaysia. He helped to set up the department in May 1970, and thereon served the department for more than 3 decades. And of course, serving in various academic capacities, including as Dean of the Faculty of Development Science. And upon retirement from UKM, he moved to Sarawak, where he was appointed as a professor and chair of Nusantara Studies at the University Malaysia Sarawak for several years. And he is also a life member of the Malaysian Social Science Association. I hope I am not giving outdated CV of you, Professor Abdul Halim Ali. I'm so sorry, Professor Sharifah. I had your old CV. It will be updated. So with that, may I now invite Professor Abdul Halim Ali to give his view. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. I shall focus my discussion on 3 points. One is the turbulent environment in the 1960s, and where I shall try to trace the events leading to the present disquieting political moment for Malaysia. The question is it a case of if anything can go wrong, it will? Or have the chickens have come home to rest? The second point I would like to make is the recent constitutional amendment, which I rather call it constitutional appeasement, which is more symbolic than real, as James earlier on mentioned. And the third one is, which I'm going to emphasize, the present political quagmire, a difficult and even a dangerous situation as it is, is perhaps best solved in the formal social and a formal political condition from which Malaysia grows and develops. This formal situation is the matrix. The matrix is the matrix of nationhood. And along with it is political re-socialization. And by socialization is meant political behaviors that are acceptable to society. Now, on the first focus, event that lead to the historical grievances, the memory of the formation of Malaysia among the people of Sabah and Sarawak has been that the two territories willingly formed a new entity called Malaysia. That was the political campaign theme in the two states in the early 1960s. It was as if Malaya was an equal partner of Sabah and Sarawak. It was akin to a confederation, as in Canada, when in 1867, it joined together the provinces and territories to form Canada as we know today. Now, the term confederation, of course, was never used as such. It was implied rather vaguely too at that time. Now, in Malaysia, outside of Sabah and Sarawak, in Persekutuan Tanah Melayu, Malaysia was perceived quite differently. It was perceived as an enlargement of Persekutuan Tanah Melayu with 3 additional states. It was akin, although it was never used, it was akin to USA having incorporated Alaska and Hawaii while retaining July 4th as its national day. Now, the change of the term Malaya to Malaysia, according to the peninsular population, was not substantial in nature. Then came the constitutional reality. In general terms, Sabah and Sarawak are not different from any of the states in the peninsula. It took a long while for the two states to point out a dissonance of sort between historical memory and constitutional reality. The bone of contention is therefore, to my mind, a sort of a perceived anomaly between their conception of the federation and the first article in the federal constitution. And this has a powerful lingering effect on the inter-regional relationship until today. Let me recall those days in the 1960s. It was a beguiling in the early 1960s when the concept of Malaysia was first proposed. As I recall it, as an ordinary, very ordinary undergraduate activist in 1960, it was a moment involving promise of rapid change, but also confusion. Extreme emotion erupted when Peninsular Malays were accused of colonizing Sabah by Fuad Stephen. There is an African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Evidently, Tunku Abdul Rahman preferred to go alone. He was in unseemly haste. He ignored Indonesia. He sidelined the Philippines. His principal concern was British approval of the new federation. He truly went alone again when only a few years later, in September 1965, just as the Federation of Malaysia came to pass, Tunku Abdul Rahman alone, I repeat alone, from his hospital bed threw Singapore out. So 1960s was an era of intrigues. It was interesting too, or being unusual, for which it did not have an obvious answer. Given this extraordinary political landscape, I recall that undergraduate activists in the 1960s who were in their 20s were known to have dark humor and even cruel sense of fun, very often very toxic. The the Malaysia planners were considered fair game by the students. Tengku Abdul Rahman was seen as a trickster, albeit a good one. Of course, the master trickster was the British representatives here, as James pointed out just now. Those planners from Borneo were perceived as rather clueless. Affectionately, they're more soft with them. They were considered Christopher Columbus. Columbus did not know where he was going. When he got there, he didn't know where he was. He called it India when it was, in fact, the Caribbean. Now, is it possible that Columbus syndrome lingers on even today? We'll have to wait for a new set of data on the formation of Malaysia, especially the role of the British representatives in Borneo from non-Anglo-American archives. Where is the source of present-day grievances? Why and how did the Borneo leaders in 1963 signed gleefully so, the controversial document? That relates to James's query. Who is accountable for the past decade, deeds? I'm immediately reminded of a 19th century thinker. It seems to me that no matter how we attempt to break off the past, it never loses its grip on us. This 19th century thinker once said that it is true that men make their history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under the circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare in the brain of the living. Is that what we are going through now? Now, beguiling as it were, the 1960s also offered hopes because the collective and the social memories of a culture zone and also the maritime civilization of Nusantara were about to be realized, albeit only in parts. So too was the national intent of the 20th century, the Melayu Raya. Malaysia was regarded as a prelude to the envisioned Greater Malaysia. That was the historical model of the new nation to be that they hoped to realize with the inevitable departure of colonialism. But as historical fate, had it, the second model of Malaysia was conceived out of exigencies of the domino effect theory endorsed by Kuala Lumpur, Britain, and USA. Only 8 years earlier, the Asia-Africa Bandung Conference was held in Indonesia in 1955. It was a revolutionary decolonializing envisioning of former colonialized theory. So the key word was self-determination. So there were two models of Malaysia, the first being born out of social and collective memories. The other was hastily constructed by contemporary geopolitical expediency of the retreating colonial force, and the colonial force won the day. Now, on the second point, on parliamentary appeasement, a minister was designed to pilot a constitution bill in the Dewan Rakyat, and there were three main provisions amended, which are of interest. And the change, it appears to me that this is merely an act of profound symbolism. It is according to a constitutional law expert, it was more symbolic than substantial and unlikely to resolve any woes. He summed up that the autonomy and the special rights are already contained in about 80 provisions of the federal constitution, including autonomy over immigration. Immigration is a sore thumb. It's sticking out like a sore thumb. Such anomaly, state within state. And then my third point is the nation building. And now that the chickens have come home to roost after nearly half a century, any constitutional solution has to have a context beyond the legal. Following the law too strictly without recourse to and having a sense of history and sociology of the country and the region, such a deliberation may reduce tension or even soothe historical guilt, but it is devoid of wisdom, so necessary to address complex problems that weigh heavily upon us. Political resource socialization of Malaysia has to be worked out upon the concept of nationhood. It is time to concentrate on the evolution of Malaysian nation. This becomes all the more necessary because according to Abdul Rahman Embung, there are 5 contesting notions of what constitutes the Malaysian nation. A national consensus has yet to emerge. This is one national question hitherto unresolved. What are the 5 competing notions of the nation? 1, according to Abdul Rahman Embung, 1, the developmentist doctrine of a Bumiputra-based nation in which English is given prominence since it is considered the gateway to development and progress. 2, a Bumiputra-based nation, but one with Malay as the defining identity, Malay language. 3, the notion of a nation that is grounded in the subjective imaginings of the people shaped by the understanding and recognition of Malay as the language of Malaysia and the Nusantara region, while respecting and promoting other languages and cultures. This view advocates bilingual, or better still, multilingual proficiency. 4, the 4th notion is the notion of a civic nation, espousing freedom and equality among different ethnic groups in the name of democracy and universal human rights. The 5th and the final notion of a nation is of an Islamic nation which rejects ethnicity and propagates a transnationalism based on its interpretation of Islam. As we have not reached a consensus on the type of nation we desire, the various typologies of the notion of a nation should be debated continuously. Surveys upon surveys should be administered. A series of national referendum should follow. Personally, my preferred model of a nation for the moment is China, given the fact that the country shares identical language problems in Malaysia. Example, Inner Mongolia and Tibet. In early 2021, for instance, Beijing intensified its integration policy by correcting wrong ideas on what constitutes Chinese culture and Chinese identity. This is especially so in Xinjiang and Tibet, where the ethnic problem should be resolved in the Chinese way with Chinese characteristics. A strong reminder came from Beijing that Inner Mongolia has to memorize a mantra, a dictum that the Han majority population cannot be ignored. And to me, the concept of Chinese characteristics seems attractive. So perhaps this was the first respondent in the survey today by Academy Professor Malaysia on the preferred notion of a Malaysian nation. And I like to be considered to be the first respondent for the intended survey. Thank you very much, moderator.
Thank you, Professor Halim. Very exhaustive analysis and examinations plus observation of what Professor James Chin had deliberated. And to justify all this, I now would like to invite Professor James Chin to respond to the 2 discussants' observations, examination, and analysis of the subject of MA 63. Please have the floor, Professor James Chin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thank you very much for the comments by Dr. Sharifah and Professor Halim. I think they provided an interesting angle to my earlier presentation. But given the time limitations, I would like the participants who spent the last 1.5 hours with us, maybe we can get questions from the floor. I think it's only fair that because they spent the last 90 minutes listening to the three of us, maybe we give them a chance to participate.
I get the limit tadi tak sampai 12 lah. Good.
Right. I have so far one question. Zarul.
Yes, Dato. There is one question.
Maybe you would like to address that question to Professor James Chin, and
Yes,
then we
yes.
will keep on having other questions for Professor James.
Yes, Dato. There is one question coming from Melanie Helton, as you can see at the chat box here. Well, she asked, everything Dayak related with land is a form of soft colonization that violates the rights and origins of those who ought to be treated better based on Sarawak's history and racial position. Unfortunately, their rights were compromised when the case reached the court since they lack documentation of their land deeds. So who wrote the letter and who is in charge? So yeah.
Okay, I would start off by saying that that is a very, very complex. It sounds like a very simple question, but it's a very complex issue. Melanie is talking about a thing called native customary rights land in Sarawak NCR. That requires the academy to issue a separate invitation for me to speak again, because it is really a topic by itself. I don't think it's possible for me to give a short answer. It will take 1 hour to explain it. It's a highly complex issue. The only link I can think of that's related to this afternoon's seminar is that this issue of NCR land is not unique to Sarawak. It's also found in Sabah. And a lot of it has got to do with colonial legacy. Again, the transfer of the rules and legal definition of land pre-Malaysia to Malaysia, and we are now left with issues about who owns the right to land. In the wider context, this has got to do with what we call native title, the issue of native title. So I think it's a very, very complex issue. I don't think I can justify giving a very short answer.
Right. Thank you, Professor James. Is there any other questions on the chat box? There is one question from Ding Siu King. Very contemporary, very recent question. Can Johor leave Malaysia based on the constitution? Not sure whether. Yeah, Professor James Chin.
Yes, I'll answer that.
Yeah. Okay.
Strictly speaking, there is nothing in the Malaysian constitution. There is not. In fact, the word succession is not even mentioned in the Malaysian constitution. So strictly speaking, all states have the right to raise this issue. Problem with succession is that you're talking about basically a political and security issue. In the Malaysian context, and I have to be very, very clear about what I'm talking about. In the Malaysian context, the question is that who is willing to pay the blood price? Because it is quite clear, any states in Malaysia, in addition to the Borneo states, any states in the peninsula, if they want to leave the federation for whatever reasons, even if it is a valid reason, right? Putrajaya will not allow the states to leave the federation for two reasons. One is, of course, the integrity of the entire federation. If you allow one state to go, then it will have a cascading effect. But the second reason is more historical. The Malay political class in Malaya has come to some sort of a conclusion that what happened in 1965 should not have happened. In other words, Tunku Abdul Rahman should have taken a firmer hand, and that the allowing Singapore to leave Malaysia through a midnight act of parliament was a mistake on the part of Tunku Abdul Rahman, and that the current Malay establishment are not willing to repeat the same mistake. And therefore, if any states in Malaysia are contemplating or trying to pull out Malaysia, the question comes back to who is willing to pay the blood price. And here I'm talking about using the army, the police, the security services to stop this thing from happening. It's not the answer I suppose people like to hear, but that is the reality.
Thank you, Professor James. There's one question from Karisma Putra Abdurrahman. Thank you for the lecture and discussion. A question for Professor James Chin. You mentioned that we have 3 different avenues for moving forward on the issue of Malaya, Sabah, Sarawak relation, i.e., that is working on MA 63, working on a new framework, or laying out terms for succession. How viable would option 2, a new MA entirely, be in terms of time frame? Would the Malayan political class entertain such a notion? That is your question.
Thank you very much for that really, really interesting, important question. So what I was referring to when I talk about a new set of political framework, in constitutional terms, I'm talking about a new federal-state relationship. Now, in the Malaysian context, the way it will work in practice, the way it will work is that you have to change the current system now. The current system is basically what we call the 3 schedule lists. We've got the federal list, the state list, and the concurrent list. But the problem is that doesn't work very well with Sabah and Sarawak. So it may be the cleanest way is that you have to, amend all the other parts of the constitution that mention Sabah and Sarawak and put all the special rights of Sabah and Sarawak into list number 4. Because certain things like the environment and tourism, right, it's not very clear where they sit. So it may be a situation where if you want new federal-state relationship, in relation to Sabah and Sarawak, you may have to bring in schedule number 4. But on the wider context, I think what happened with the Malaysian Federation is that the federal government became too powerful at the expense of the states. People keep forgetting that the picture is not black and white in Malaya as well, because in Malaya, some states were unfederated. They have their own civil service as well, and therefore they have a very strong state political culture. It is a standing joke, as you know, right? A non-Kelantanese can never hope to succeed in Kelantan. It's just like going down to Negeri Sembilan. If you're not from Negeri Sembilan, there's no way you can succeed in a political thing there. Same thing with Johor. So the issue of state rights or state nationalism is not unique to Sabah and Sarawak. It's just that in terms of Sabah and Sarawak, the 2 compelling narratives is that they've been marginalized for the last 50 years, and they actually have a form of agreement that says that they got more rights. So it's a very compelling narrative. So what I'm talking about is that moving forward, we may have to look at a new power sharing equation, a new federal-state relationship, and a special mechanism that takes into account Sabah and Sarawak. But as I said earlier in my earlier part of my presentation, at the current moment, the Malay political class is in disarray because it's not clear who speaks on behalf of the Malays. So that's the reason why everybody is waiting for GE15. And that's the reason why I argued earlier that nothing is going to happen in Malaysia until GE15 is sorted out.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions for Professor Chin? I think that's about all at the moment. No more question coming from the participants. But I do have one question, if I may be given the permission as moderator, Professor James Chin. We have this begging and ongoing, litigation between Malaysia and Philippines as regard to Sabah claims, by Philippines. And I don't see this stop. This will stop because the issue will keep on. And the latest is in relation to the arbitration proceeding as regard to the claim by Sultan Sulu, the Sultanate of Sulu, as regard to Sabah, So where do you see the, as regard to, Sabah as a wilayah or a state, and the federal government, in fact, had given their stern or making a position that Sabah will always be Malaysia, But do you foresee that these sort of contentious issues be raised again and again by Philippines? I know they say it's political. Every time when there is an election, whoever is contending in Philippines will raise this issue. But when can, I don't know whether we can stop this or when will this end? May I have your view on this?
So my view is that this thing will not end. The reason is because Sabah claim is actually written into the Filipino constitution. Most Malaysians do not know that. That's point number one. Secondly, to update you on the arbitration claim, the supposedly arbitration claim that came through against the Malaysian government, that claim is not enforceable. The reason is because there is the issue of local standing. So that claim is not enforceable. It will generate a lot of political hit. It will generate a lot of a lot of media attention and everything. But legally speaking, it cannot be enforced. So my understanding is that the Malaysian government has already engaged all the lawyers in the European cities to file set aside the claim, and that will be successful. I do not see a reason why it can proceed the way the thing was handed down. Because on the Malaysian side, the Malaysian courts actually knew about it. This is again, Malaysian people don't know about this, but even before the arbitration was set up in Spain, the Malaysian government has already filed a thing to the KK High Court to say that they will not recognize it already. So there was no way that thing can be enforced. So there's no way people don't have to worry about losing their homes. This is just not enforceable. But in terms of the Filipino claim, yes, at the end of the day, it is a political claim. But because it is written in the Filipino constitution, it will become what we call a gray area. So in terms of developments between Philippines and Malaysia, in terms of Sabah, that issue, my understanding is that it will be put on the back burner. It will not be used by the Philippines as long as there is no other outstanding issues between Malaysia and the Philippines. The thing that is holding everything together is, of course, the ASEAN framework. So as long as the ASEAN framework is in place, I don't see the Philippines pursuing this claim. Over the long term, I also do not see the Philippines pursuing this claim in an active arena because for this part of the world, I think the number one issue is the rise of China. Again, an external thing. So for the immediate future, of course, I can't claim to be able to see 50 years down the road. But for the immediate future, there is no way the Philippines are going to make a claim. And I'm 110% sure that the incoming president, Bongbong Marcos, he's just going to put this on the back burner because it has no political capital. There's really nothing he can do because on the ground it is clear that that the Malaysian authorities have sovereign rights in Sabah. The bigger problem is the Moro people in the southern Philippines. They like to play this game. But what is not widely known in Malaysia is that people don't understand that there is no such thing as Sultan of Sulu. There was actually 6 claimants. 6 people claim to be the Sultan. 2 of them are actually living in Sabah. So it's interesting that 2 out of the 6 are living in Sabah. And in fact, if you have some money to spare, you can actually buy a datukship from one of the sultans. So I won't take this thing too seriously, not for the immediate future at least.
Thank you, Professor James James. One question from Sarjit Singh. Hello, Professor James. Thank you for your public lecture. Question is, why are Sabahan leaders not as steadfast as Sarawak leaders on Malaya's Ketuanan agenda?
The answer is very simple. The reason is because the major parties in Sabah, at least half of the parties in power in Sabah, are branches of the Malayan parties like Perikatan Nasional, like Bersatu, like UMNO, Barisan Nasional. In Sarawak, basically, if you look at the governing coalition in Sarawak, GPS is made up of Sarawak-based parties. These parties have very little connection with Malayan parties other than the fact that they support the Barisan Nasional. In fact, I would argue that the parties in Sarawak have no loyalties. Their only loyalties is to get into power. So whoever is in federal government, they will support. And that's the reason why GPS has refused to join Barisan, has refused to join Perikatan. They will just say that we will support you as part of the ruling coalition, but we will not be a formal member.
Thank you. Zarul, we have time for
Well, we have 10 minutes left, Prof.
10 minutes.
Yeah.
I think I would like to wrap up the session, but before we do that, we'll have a closing remark by Professor James, followed by Dr. Munira and Prof. Halim. Very short closing remark, please. Then I will close the session. Professor James Shin, would you like to make the closing remark?
Thank you very much, Dato'. I think there are 2 points I want to make. One is that Malaysia agreement issue, or the issue of marginalization of Sabah and Sarawak and the rise of state nationalism. This is not going away. The Malay political establishment in Putrajaya or in Malaya will have to deal with this issue, and they have to be very sensitive to history to deal with this issue. Secondly, I think it's very important to understand that the wider context of all these issues is that the colonial legacy in Southeast Asia still impacts today. We should not, think that we are unique. We should not think that we are not touched by history. So it's very important that Malaysians from all sides, it doesn't matter where you're coming from, you need to understand not only the history of your own country, but understand the history of the region. Because, a lot of the things that's happening in Malaysia now is due to our history. And if we don't understand our history, we're going to make a whole series of mistakes coming up. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor James. May I invite Dr. Sharifah to make a closing remark?
My only closing remark is that the bigger picture of what Malaysian politics has evolved into is we have lost track of how to coexist. Within Malaya itself, we don't know how to coexist. And this domination of one ethnicity and religion over all the rest, I think this is very unhealthy, and it's an unhealthy trend. And as James said, we are unable to solve the problem of MA63 and East Malaysia because already we do not know how to deal with how to coexist and how to handle difference. So that's how I see it. I'm very pessimistic about the future for that reason. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Over to you, Professor Halim, for your closing remark.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of points. It is interesting, for example, to note over the concept of Malaysia, that there were no opposition, meaningful opposition to the concept, but the way it was formed. For example, it is interesting to note too that the former governor of Sarawak, Ahmad Zaidi, supported the concept of Malaysia, but disagreed with its composition nor the way it was formed. Then even Sukarno and Makapagal did not reject the concept of Malaysia, but insisted upon a referendum. And point 3, none really were opposed to a reunification of the maritime civilization of Nusantara, except the few insular and the clannish who had no historical or social memories of their own, and those bereft of the historical and cultural conception of the region. And the final point, my reference to these historical anecdotes, such as the pledge of Palapa of the 14th century by Gajah Mada, and the notion of a nation of intent are made to express continuity of history that James values very much. The period between 1963 and now, from a long durée perspective of history, it is only a drop in the ocean. So there's no reason for pessimism or any reason for political cynicism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Halim. And my closing remark would be that this has been a very enriching session. It has been most informative. As expected, Professor James Chin has successfully elucidated the intricacies of the subject in relation to MA 63, and I hope participants are now very familiar with the historical perspective, the political perspective of Sabah, Sarawak, and the federal government. And I like the idea that perhaps we should look into the new model of federal-state relations. I think that should be something to move on at the end of the day. So thank you so much to Professor James Jane, to our distinguished discussant, Dr. Sharifah Monira Alatas and Professor Halim Ali, for giving your inputs and your thoughts on the subject of MA 63. And thank you, Academy Professor Malaysia, for giving us this opportunity. Thank you, and we hope to see you again in our next session. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Prof, let's take some group photo, Prof. Is it okay? Before we end our webinar, is it okay? Please, you just turn on your camera so that we can have a group photo, please. All right, okay. Wait. All right, 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, the second page, 1, 2, 3, smile. Right, Prof. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ada orang smile tak nampak.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof.
Rahman, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well conducted, exactly on time. Yeah. And James, it was nice to meet you after years, James.